Okay, dear friends, welcome. It's very good to see you all. My dear friend, Dr. Mark Fairchild of Huntington University, a biblical Indiana Jones of today, without an exaggeration. He's going to talk to us about the first journey of Apostle Paul through rough Armenian Cilicia, which is located on the very southeastern corner of what's today's Turkey, on Anatolian Peninsula. But without taking too much time from Dr. Mark's presentation, I'm turning microphone and camera to him. Mark, welcome. Thank you very much. And I truly feel very blessed to know you personally, and I want to appreciate God's providence and give praise to God and our good friend Levent for putting you on the boat from Ephesus to Patmos, where we, recaptured the journey into exile by, John the Evangelist, and really truly cherish that relation. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us all today, and we eagerly waiting for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. I treasure this relationship that first began, as you mentioned, on a boat ride out to Patmos. First time I met you, and we connected with Facebook, and we've talked since then. Unfortunately, last spring, we had made plans for me to fly out to Binghamton, just share with your congregation, with the seminary out there, but COVID knocked that down. And so this is maybe a little bit of a substitute, a way of patching things together. We're starting to open up. In Huntington, I actually had a face-to-face meeting with folks up in Fort Wayne just yesterday. As I was sharing with Ilya a little bit earlier, we haven't been terribly impacted with COVID, and we're taking a lot of precautions. Even at the university, after each and every class, we're scrubbing down the desks, handles, anything where there's touch points. And so we've been very fortunate that we've not been terribly impacted with the COVID, but we still need to be very careful in all that we do. I want to share with you a PowerPoint that I've put together, and then we'll talk about, you can see that, yes?
Yes, we could.
Okay. So Ilya asked me to share a little bit about my travels. And Ilya and I have talked about this before, but I've been to many, many places throughout Turkey. Turkey is the cradle of Christianity. And I often share with people that Christianity began in Israel, so we can call that the birthplace of Christianity. But once we get into the Acts of the Apostles, and we go from the Acts of the Apostles all the way to the book of Revelation, Christianity was centered in Turkey. This was, like I say, the cradle of Christianity. And it's where most of the New Testament books were written to or from. All 7 ecumenical councils took place in Turkey. Many of the most important theologians came from Turkey. This was where the gospel began. And you're familiar with that, of course, with the 3 journeys, missionary journeys that are recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. And it just exploded from Anatolia into the Mediterranean world. But we want to talk about one of those persons that God used in a mighty way to share that gospel. You're familiar with Paul. Paul did not start out as a Christian. In fact, he started out persecuting Christians. But on the road to Damascus, you're familiar with this, I'm sure, he met the risen Lord, realized it's all true, and he became the strongest advocate for Christianity. The thing is, though, in Acts chapter 9, we read about Paul's conversion, and he is not mentioned much again until Acts chapter 13, when he begins the mission to Cyprus and Galatia. Now, what transpires there is approximately 10 or 11 years. So I asked the question, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, we've got to ask this question: what was Paul doing during those first 10 or 11 years following his conversion? So one of our sources, of course, is the Bible. Okay, and what does the Bible tell us about Paul's earliest ministry? Not much. Okay, following his conversion on the Damascus road, Paul gives us a little bit of autobiographical information in the first 2 chapters of his letter to the Galatians. So we're going to be a little bit about some of these verses. But in verse 17, he says, I went away to Arabia. So after his conversion, he goes to Damascus, begins preaching the gospel in Damascus, and encounters some opposition. As a consequence, he went away to Arabia. Then the next verse, verse 18, Paul says, 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem. Because, so here's the program. Paul goes to Damascus. En route, he meets the Lord, shares the gospel, begins preaching in Damascus, flees from Damascus because of the opposition, and spends some time in Arabia. Then following his journey in Arabia, he returns to Damascus. Once again, he preaches the gospel in Damascus, and opposition takes place. And so he's let down in a basket over the walls of Damascus because they're guarding the gates, and he flees and goes down to Jerusalem. And this is what he mentions in verse 18. 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem. Not surprisingly, when he arrives in Jerusalem, his life is threatened. It's important to understand that Paul was being groomed for leadership positions within Judaism. He was a disciple of Gamaliel, who was known as the most famous, the most notable rabbi in Jerusalem during the first century. And when writing to the Galatians, one of the things that Paul talks about is he was head and shoulders above all the other students among the rabbinic academy, okay? And that's one of the reasons why he was given the task of trying to deal with the Christians who were emerging within Jerusalem during that period of time, and was primarily responsible for the death of Stephen that you read about, Acts chapter 7, Acts chapter 8, okay? And when he learned that Christians had fled to Damascus, Paul was intent in wiping out this false teaching, this perversion of Judaism. And so he pursued them to Damascus. That's when he met the risen Lord. So when he returns to Jerusalem 3 years later after his conversion, Paul will not keep his mouth shut. He's excited about the faith, and he realizes how important this is. So he begins proclaiming the gospel in Jerusalem. Well, some of his former colleagues realize now that Paul has become, in their terms, a traitor. What are we going to do with him? Okay, so there's a plot to kill him. And when the disciples, the Christian disciples, realize this plot for his well-being, they pack him off and send him to Tarsus. And he's in Tarsus then for a period of 7 to 9 years. Even though that's not mentioned in Acts, we can figure that out from the chronology of these events. This is also reflected, Paul makes scant mention of this in one verse, his ministry, which took place 7 to 9 years. He mentions in one verse, Galatians 1:21, he says, I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. That's all he says. Realize 7 to 9 years is twice as long as any of Paul's missions that are mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Yet Luke, when he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, for whatever reasons, he skips over this. After 7 to 9 years, in Acts chapter 11, we read that Barnabas, who had been sent up to the church at Antioch. Antioch was a big city at that time. Antioch was considered to be one of the 5 largest cities in all the Mediterranean. Barnabas realizes that the church at Antioch is so big and the ministry is so overwhelming that he needs help. Where does he go? He realizes that there's this good, solid Christian fellow that they had sent off to Tarsus some 7 to 9 years earlier. So he goes to Tarsus, finds him, and brings him back to Antioch to help him with the ministry there in Antioch. And the wording is very interesting here in Acts 11:25. because the wording, the way that Luke words this is, he sought Paul, he looked for Paul. The implication being he wasn't in Tarsus. Well, if he wasn't in Tarsus, where was he? He's in Cilicia. The region, rough Cilicia in particular, is where I believe Paul was, the region southwest of Tarsus. Okay, if Paul was back in Tarsus or even elsewhere in Cilicia, how do we know that he was doing ministry? Well, I think it can be easily implied by the fact that Paul, after his Christian conversion, was doing ministry wherever he went. In Damascus, shortly after his conversion, he was preaching Jesus. Threatened, went down to Arabia, was probably doing ministry there, went back to Damascus, once again began preaching Jesus, then went to Jerusalem. I don't think Paul is the kind of person who sits idle and does nothing. But we have additional information. We know that churches were established in Cilicia before Paul and Barnabas's first mission. Realize that Paul's first mission, which is recorded in Acts chapter 13, did not go to Cilicia. It went to the island of Cyprus and then north from the island of Cyprus up into Galatia. I'll show you a map in just a moment. Okay, but they didn't go anywhere near Cilicia. Yet, before the second mission, in Acts chapter 15, we read about the Jerusalem Council. And when the decision was rendered at the Jerusalem Council, a letter was sent to Christians and churches in Cilicia and elsewhere. So you have to scratch your head and wonder, okay, how were these churches and Christians evangelized in Cilicia? Because we don't read anywhere else in the Acts of the Apostles about ministry going on in Cilicia. Well, recollect what happened in Acts chapter 9. Paul was sent back to Tarsus in Cilicia, one of the major cities in Cilicia, during that period of time. And then another piece of information. Before Paul and Silas departed on the second missionary journey, what is often called the second missionary journey, in reality is not really a second missionary journey because he had journeys prior to that. Okay, but Paul parts company with Barnabas and teams up with Silas, and as they begin the next journey, Acts chapter 15, verse 41, it's stated that he traveled through Syria and Cilicia, and the expression here is strengthening the churches. That's an important word. It doesn't say they were founding or establishing the churches. Strengthening the churches tells you that these churches already existed, which again begs the question, okay, if churches were already founded there, how were they founded? It's my belief that those churches were founded during the 7 to 9 year period when Paul was in Tarsus, and I don't think he remained in Tarsus. I think he certainly evangelized the people of Tarsus, but went far beyond Tarsus into other cities, towns, and villages throughout Cilicia. So let's put together a rough timeline, okay? This timeline cannot be pinned down precisely in terms of dates. So for instance, Paul's birth, the best we can come up with is Paul was probably born anywhere between 4 BC and 4 AD. That's a pretty wide sweep. Paul never mentions his age specifically. Then we also know that at some point during his adolescence, he moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem, became a student of Gamaliel. Rabbis would typically take students once they were beyond bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah, of course, is 12 years of age. And so it's during that period of time, at some point, again, we can't pin that down precisely, that Paul moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem. Then one date that we can be a little more firm on is Paul's conversion. Most scholars agree that Paul was converted around 33 AD, plus or minus 1 year, okay? Then, okay, Paul's journey to Arabia that we just got through talking about, Galatians chapter 1:17, would probably be dated between 33 and 35. This ministry that I'm going to focus on, talk about the remaining time that we're together, probably took place in Cilicia between the years 35 and 44. And then later, when we get to Acts chapter 13, we read about Paul and Barnabas going off on their first missionary journey to Cyprus and Galatia. And then the timeline that I've got, I can't stretch that timeline any further. But we know that Paul died in Rome probably between the years 65, 66 AD. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of the flow in terms of time. I mentioned to you that I'd show you a map so we can get some ideas as to what's going on. You can see, is my cursor appearing? Okay, here it is. You can see it on my screen? Yes?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Mhm.
Okay, Tarsus is way up here. Okay, and this whole region is Cilicia. I'm going to show you a close-up map a little bit later. Actually, if we go back to the early church father, Jerome tells us that Paul's family originated in Gishalov, which is in the northern Galilee. Okay, and it's an interesting statement by Jerome. He actually mentions it 2 times. He says that Paul's family originated in Gishala, and they were taken, that's a passive voice, okay, to Tarsus. Now, we also know from Josephus that during this early period, when Paul was a newborn, just a youth, this region of northern Galilee was rebelling against the Romans, and the Romans would come in, sack the cities, kill off the combatants, and then sell off all the residents, women, children, non-combatants, on the Roman slave markets. Roman slave markets were massive. And so Paul and his family were taken, using Jerome's words, were taken to Tarsus, and probably were a slave family. At some point, they were manumitted. In the Roman system, once a slave, you're not always a slave, okay? Freedom could be granted. And if you were owned, okay, by a Roman family, and if you were successfully integrated into the Roman system, you could be given Roman citizenship, which is how I think Paul received Roman citizenship. You read about Paul's Roman citizenship in Acts of the Apostles. But again, looking at our map, Tarsus is way up here. Paul, as a youth, came down here to Jerusalem, and that's where he was functioning as a student of Gamaliel. He was en route to Damascus up here at the time of his conversion. After his conversion, Paul says he went to Arabia. Arabia is not the Saudi Arabian peninsula down below my map here, because that was all desert, not too many people lived there. But instead, Arabia was the kingdom of the Nabateans, okay? And the capital being Petra. So if you're wondering where was Paul, we don't know, because he doesn't give us specifics in terms of cities, but in all likelihood, he was probably spending some time at Petra, then returned to Damascus, to Jerusalem, and then after that, he was sent off here to Tarsus for 7 to 9 years. At the conclusion of that 7 to 9 year period of time, this city over here, it's in bigger, bolder print because it's a larger city, Antioch, that's where Barnabas was sent to minister to the growing, emerging church at Antioch. And when the task became too cumbersome for him, that's when he realized that not far away over here at Tarsus, let's get this guy named Paul to help out. And he searched for Paul, brought him back to Antioch. Let's move to another map. This map is a map of Turkey, what was called Anatolia, actually, in the 1st century. And this is the region, I'm circling it here. I don't have a pen or anything of that sort, but this region here is what is called Cilicia. Cilicia is divided into 2 parts. The eastern part here, from about here and over, is called smooth Cilicia, okay? The reason why it's smooth is because this mountain range, a very steep mountain range, it's called the Taurus mountain range, and all the alluvial soil, okay, that came down for millennia, okay, created this delta region, a very fertile, nice delta region, okay? And that's why this half of Cilicia is called smooth Cilicia. Now, when you get to the western half, down here to the southwest of Tarsus, Tarsus is actually located, again, if you're wondering, right where my pointer is, right there is Tarsus. If you get down to this southern half, this is called rough Cilicia. And it's called rough Cilicia for good reason. These Taurus mountains are close to the coast. You can just go a few miles inland and you're getting into the foothills, and a few more miles to the interior. You're into some very steep and some very rugged countryside. And I'll show you some photographs of this. You see cliffs that drop off into canyons and gorges that will drop off as many as 600 and 800 feet, sheer drops to the canyon floor. It's an unbelievable region. First, let's give you a couple photographs of Tarsus. This is a city street in the middle of Tarsus. Unfortunately, Tarsus today is a sizable city, a little bit bigger than Binghamton. Tarsus today is about 400,000 people. Not enormous, but big. And the modern city covers all of the ancient city. So there's not a whole lot to see. There's probably 4, maybe 5 different places around the city of Tarsus where we're able to see the ancient city that's been exposed. This is the best section right here, okay? And you can see here, this is a basalt paved road, probably one of the main roads in Tarsus. You can see gutters here on the side. Underneath, I actually climbed down underneath here in these holes. This is the sewer system, and they've got a very nice sewer system that was constructed here at Tarsus. And then off onto the periphery here on the right-hand side, as well as the left-hand side, this street would have been lined with columns. You can see a couple of columns. So there'd been a colonnade running the entire length. And then also further to the side would be shops. Another place in Tarsus that you can see is actually in a mosque. The mosque was built on top of an ancient bridge. And this is the bridge. The Kidness River used to run here. The Kidness River has changed its course today. It still runs through Tarsus, but another part of Tarsus. And so when the river changed, of course, the water dried up, but you can still see this has been excavated, the remains of this bridge that once crossed the Kidness River. And when they decided to build a mosque, they built the mosque over the top of this. So that's another place that can be seen in Tarsus. Elsewhere in smooth Cilicia, okay, you can say, hey, that's smooth Cilicia. I see a lot of mountains there. Yeah, that's smooth Cilicia. Even smooth Cilicia is quite mountainous. And here we see a fortress on top of one of those mountains. This is at a site called Tarsus. It took me 4 times to get to the top of Tarsus. And I'm pretty determined in my journeys that I'm going to get to someplace. So when I failed the first 3 times, I was very frustrated. It got to the point where it was so steep that I couldn't ascend without ropes. And I'm not a skilled climber with ropes, so I abandoned the first 3 times. The 4th time, I finally found a route up there. It wasn't easy. And so I've been up there 3 times since then. But it's an amazing, amazing site. And you feel like you're on top of the world because the views from there are just spectacular. But that was like I say, a fortress up at the top. Now we get into rough Cilicia. And this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time from this point forward. Rough Cilicia is loaded with canyons and gorges like this. Sheer drop-offs to the canyon floor. The shrubbery is very dense. So even traveling around there today, there's not many people that live up there, okay? There are some, but scant few people. And as a consequence, the area of rough Cilicia is probably very similar to what it looked like back in Paul's day. The only difference being that the villages, the towns, and the few cities that are interspersed throughout the mountains and in the canyons are not well preserved. Of course, they've been neglected for 2,200 years. Another section of rough Cilicia. You can see the canyon walls. I'm down at the bottom here. You can see a waterfall as a stream, of course, is running through. But there aren't very many ways that you can penetrate the Taurus Mountains and actually get into the interior. One of the ways you can get into the interior, of course, is to follow the water course. But even the water course, as you can see, it isn't easy to go up through the water course. So at any rate, these were areas where the residents built their homes, their towns, their villages, and their cities in strategic locations. That's me standing alongside a Roman road. You can just see the Roman road, a portion of that Roman road off on my left-hand side. And it runs along the perimeter of, again, a chasm that is opened up in rough Cilicia. I thank my Turkish friends because they have been helping me. I've got some Turkish friends who are cartographers, and so they know how to make maps. And what I have been doing is some of the places that I've explored, I have given them GPS locations. And what they have done is they've come up with this map. I've also found many Roman roads that still exist, many Roman bridges, and many various artifacts that I have provided them with GPS information. As a consequence, we've been able to come up with this map. And I'm proud of this map. I like this map because it's the only map that gives you details about some of these structures that give us information about where was Paul going during this period of time, and what were some of the places that he may have visited. When there, you can see amazing structures. One of the reasons for that is nobody goes up there. One of the reasons why antiquities are commonly destroyed is because of people. And that may come surprising, that may be surprising to you that certainly antiquities are destroyed by natural causes, wind, rain, frost, earthquakes, and certainly a lot of earthquakes in Turkey. Turkey's on several fault lines. But more than anything else, people destroy antiquities. And that is certainly happening today in Turkey. Here's a church, for instance. Many, many churches, and some of the earliest churches in Turkey are found in Cilicia. And these, the Byzantine churches were not built until the time following after Constantine. Okay, because Christianity was an underground movement prior to that, so you didn't have any structures that were built that could be identified as churches prior to that. But once Constantine, the Edict of Milan allowed Christians to operate above ground. Christianity was now legalized after the Edict of Milan. And so many of the earliest churches actually were constructed during this period of time. And this is one of them. But you can also see that this church has been degraded greatly, in part because of natural causes, in part because of earthquakes, but also because the local people who are up there, many of them are involved in pastoral activities. That is, they have flocks, sheep and goats and cattle, things of that sort, and they have used a lot of the blocks, the materials from these churches and from other structures for retaining walls for their flocks, or for other structures. It's called secondary use. And so a lot of these pieces you can actually see in the villages themselves. Another church, this church is further up into the mountains. This is a monastery. This is at Diocesaria. It's currently being excavated by Turkish scholars and some really good discoveries have been made at this site in particular. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but you can see it's in the valley here. You can see the canyon walls off into the distance. And this is deep into the interior. But you also have churches in the coastal areas, such as this church, which is located at Kyrikos. And you can see, if I zoom in just a little bit, you can see off into the distance, you can see the sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea off in the distance. But beautiful churches and massive, huge churches. Now we've got to ask the question, why did Paul choose to go this direction for his first mission? Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. The sites that I have identified in red with the big circles are sites where there was a Jewish population. In other words, at these sites, I have identified archaeological remains indicating that Jews lived there. We don't need, in reality, the archaeological evidence, because we also have literary sources that tell us that there was a strong Jewish presence, a large Jewish presence in Cilicia. So we already knew that. But to be more specific, this is what part of my research has been all about. Where in Cilicia can we identify some of these? And so I spent every summer for the last 12 years, with the exception of this last year. COVID kept me out of the place. But I've spent the last 12 summers prior to this last summer doing research here. And I have found tombs and inscriptions and lintels with menorahs on them, indicating that Jews once inhabited these cities and towns. So, and I'll show you a few of these. We don't have enough time to go through each of them, but at Koshkerli, Somek, Oindili, Kabacham, Chatioran, Kyrikos, Seleucia, Karabojulu, and Diocesaria, we know that there were Jews. There's archaeological remains from Jews in each of those locations. Now, I suspect that Jews lived in many of the other towns and villages throughout this region. It's just that we don't have archaeological evidence to prove it, okay? Archaeological remains don't always survive. And so that's somewhat of a problem. But again, you can see the distance. It's about 40 miles from Tarsus down into this region. And this is the region where I think Paul spent a great deal of his time. One other thing I want to mention, okay, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. I think we all know that, okay? But Paul, to his dying day, believed that it was important to share the gospel message with Jews because the Jews were the chosen people. They were elect and they were charged with a mission. Why is it that God specially elected Abraham's children, the Jewish people, and performed miracles and gave them Torah, God's word? Was it to keep them to themselves? No. If you look back to the Old Testament, Isaiah in particular reminds the Jewish people that they were given this privileged position, not to sit on that truth, but to share it with everybody else. The problem is, due to traumatic historical developments throughout the Old Testament and during the intertestamental period, the Jewish people became introverted rather than extroverted. Rather than engaging in missions, they felt that it was improper. And this is what the rabbis, most of the rabbis were teaching, that it was improper for Jews to have any kind of associations with non-Jews, with Gentile people. How can you do ministry if you can't have any kind of association with Gentile people? But Paul, when he learned the gospel, he realized that the gospel was not just for Jews, but for Gentiles as well. But he also firmly believed that it was a Jewish responsibility to discharge that mission and to go out and share the gospel with others. And that's why when Paul writes to the Romans, you're familiar with this passage, no doubt, Romans chapter 1, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Why does he say to the Jew first? To the Jew first, because they were this priestly nation Okay, this holy nation that God raised up to do the job of sharing the message with others. I might also mention that if you check out the Acts of the Apostles, whenever Paul goes on his journeys to a new city or town, he always goes to the synagogue first. He doesn't go to the agora and share the gospel. He doesn't go to the pagan temples and share the gospel. He doesn't go to the bathhouses where many people would congregate together. He always goes to the synagogue first. Why? Because, as he says to the Romans, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, but it's to the Jew first. And that's the reason why I think in my research, if I can identify locations, cities, towns, and villages that have a Jewish presence, I think it's highly likely that during that 7 to 9 year period, Paul was in these cities and towns sharing the gospel. Once again, I want you to recollect, 7 to 9 years is twice as long as any of Paul's missions that are reported in the Acts of the Apostles. So he had to spend, in my estimation, a lot of time in this region. Okay, let's see some of this stuff. This is a synagogue that I discovered back in 2007. This is at a location called Chetauren. Okay, when I first found Chetauren, I was climbing through the brush. My intent was to go to find a temple that was at the top of a ridge. And as I was making my way there, I passed this structure, looked off to my left-hand side and saw on the lintel, as you can see, this menorah, which surprised me. Of course, the menorah is the distinctive sign of a Jewish presence. If you find a menorah, you know that Jews were there. Well, after I found this in 2007, I thought, well, surely I'm not the first person to ever see this. And so over the course of the next several years, I did some research to try and find out who's been here and has anybody seen this menorah? Turns out the only person that I know that has been here since then, aside from Turkish people, no doubt some Turkish people have probably been here, but Turkish people don't know what they're looking at either, okay? But over 125 years ago, there was a British scholar, a fellow by the name of J. Theodore Bent, who with his wife came and was doing archaeological research in rough Cilicia, in this region that I'm talking about. And he came to this site. And the reason why I know he was at this site is because he identified the temple, okay, that I had been hoping to see as I came to this site. And he also found 3 inscriptions, and he made copies of those inscriptions. And I found one of those inscriptions, okay? He describes the site just as it is. The only thing is Bent never mentioned the synagogue. And it's not surprising with the heavy brush that covers this site, you know, it would be easy to miss the synagogue. At any rate, I published this in the 2012 copy of the Biblical Archaeology Review. And then shortly after that, I was invited to Vienna University. At Vienna University, they have the Jewish Institute of Archaeology, and they had read about this article and they wanted to hear more about it. This is the earliest synagogue that's ever been discovered anywhere in the world, including Palestine. This dates back to the Hellenistic period. Many scholars didn't believe that synagogues even existed during the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic period, we're talking about anywhere between 300 BC and before the Romans came, which would be about 50 BC. So those are the rough parameters. And at any rate, this is, like I say, the earliest synagogue. It's not the only synagogue, the only evidence of a Jewish presence either, because I found 5 other menorahs on the lintels in rough Cilicia. As I was, again, traveling throughout the land, I came to a location called Kabacham. Kabacham was an ancient Hellenistic village, was started during the Hellenistic period, existed through the Roman period and into the Byzantine period. There are many structures there that can be found. It's an agricultural community. And this is an underground granary. This is where grain would have been stored. And the walls were plastered because you don't want water in there with your grain. It's going to destroy your grain. And as I'm examining the inside of the granary, you can see etched upon the walls into the plaster, there's a couple of ships. There's also an animal, looks like a llama, could be a horse. You know, it's hard to identify or to distinguish between the two of them. But I also found this structure, or should they say this image, a menorah. Now, what is peculiar about this menorah is the branches are elongated, okay, in the shape of a ship. As a matter of fact, this menorah looks similar to the two other ships that are inscribed on the granary wall elsewhere. And this menorah is kind of interesting also because for the central sail, the central stem of the menorah has 3 branches, okay, which probably represents the sail of the ship. So what I conclude from this, okay, is that probably the Jews at Kabacham were involved in agricultural pursuits. They were storing their grain in this granary, and then they would ship this grain down to the nearby port. There's a port not far, probably about 10, 11 miles down to the coast at Tirtar Akale, a large granary there where grain would be stored from many cities from the interior, and then would be shipped out. Most of that grain came to Rome. So that's an interesting discovery. Then I'm going to flip through these rather quickly. These are several tombs. This is actually a sarcophagus, the lid of a sarcophagus. And you can see here in this lid, there's 2 menorah that are etched. Here's another one, sarcophagus with a lid and a menorah. Another sarcophagus, and here you can see on the lid, you can see the wing over on the right-hand side has a menorah etched onto it. That may be harder for you to see. Let me zoom in just a little closer. You can see that menorah there. But again, there are lots of sarcophagi. A sarcophagus is a stone tomb where people would be buried. And of course, you have inscriptions with Jewish names. Many times they would talk about one's occupation, and then many times also the distinctive Jewish symbol, the menorah. So I want to take a little bit of a different track here and want to talk about Paul's apocalyptic mission, okay? Because Paul's mission was different, okay? The Jewish people felt that the gospel and salvation was extended to them and them alone. But when Jesus met Paul, he called Paul to a mission to the Gentile people. Most Jews felt that that was improper. Okay, as a matter of fact, Paul was criticized for sharing the gospel with Gentile people. Good, reputable Jews wouldn't do such things, but yet Paul realized that's what God was calling him to. So on the Damascus road, taking you back to Acts chapter 9 once again, okay, Jesus appeared to Paul. And as he appeared to Paul, he was a bright and radiant light, and Paul hears the voice. And here's where Jesus reveals himself, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul says, what do you mean, persecuting you? I'm serving you, God. And here is where it is that it dawns upon Paul that he's wrong and the Christians are right, okay? And then, of course, later on, when he returns to Damascus, he arrives at Damascus. Ananias is instructed to go and to baptize Paul. And this is what God says to Ananias. He is my chosen instrument to bear my name before the Gentiles. My chosen instrument to bear my name before the Gentiles. What I want to draw your attention to, actually, before I move on to this next section that I've put up on the screen, is this is very similar to how Jesus appeared to John on the island of Patmos. Check out Revelation chapter 1, okay? Then we have another statement. This comes in Paul's letter to Galatians. Remember, I'd mentioned moments ago, a little bit earlier, that in Galatians, the first 2 chapters, this is one of the most autobiographical sections of Paul's writings. And here's where Paul talks about his gospel. Where did he receive it? Where did it come from? In verses 11 and 12, Paul says, my gospel is not according to man, I didn't get it from human beings. Instead, I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, the Greek word for revelation is the Greek word apokalypsis, which is where we get the word apocalypse. This is the exact same word that occurs in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1. As a matter of fact, it's the first word in the whole book, an apocalypse, which is also translated with the word revelation. So what Paul is basically saying is, I didn't receive this gospel in an ordinary way. I didn't talk with Peter and he told me the story of Jesus. Instead, it was a divine revelation, similar to what John received on the island of Patmos. And then we have an interesting passage also in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul says, 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. He says, I know a man, and of course, it's probably autobiographically he's speaking. I know a man, he's talking about himself, who was caught up to the third heaven and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. 14 years ago, okay, at the time when Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians, he wrote this letter anywhere between 54 and 55 AD. 54, 55 AD. Let's do the math, okay? You take away 14 years from 54, 55 AD, you're talking about 40 AD. 40 AD. Now, if you recollect, okay, the timeline that I gave you before, 40 AD is when? It's right in the middle of that 7 to 9 year period of time when Paul was in Cilicia. And so what Paul is telling us in this passage is that 14 years ago, he had an apocalyptic experience similar to what John had in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, chapter 4, John is taken up into heaven. And he's given the vision that we have that's laid out in the 22 chapters of the book of Revelation. Paul is saying, I had a similar experience. Okay, so what is this apocalyptic mission all about? Okay, this is where God is calling Paul to do what no other Jew would do. Okay, and that is to share the good news of the gospel, not just with Jewish people, but with non-Jewish people, what we call the Gentile people. And that's why Paul, shortly after his conversion, felt burdened, in spite of the dangers, felt burdened to go into this land. If we explore this land, as I have, this is something that you commonly see, a watchtower. And not just one watchtower, but many watchtowers. There are 38 watchtowers that I've discovered in rough Cilicia. Now you've got to ask the question, why do people build watchtowers? There are more watchtowers in rough Cilicia than any other part of Turkey, by far. And I mean, it's not even close. We're talking about a tight region, rough Cilicia, not even all of Cilicia, but rough Cilicia, where you see 38, and I probably haven't discovered all of them, to be honest with you. There probably are more. Okay, 38 watchtowers in this region. So here I am sitting on the top of one of the watchtowers, pondering that question, stroking my chin, scratching my head, saying, why so many watchtowers? Well, as you probably know, watchtowers are for defensive purposes. Okay, the people who build watchtowers are concerned about intruders, people who are coming up into the foothills and into the mountains. That's something we need to think about. On top of that, we have to ask the question, why are people building cities, towns, and villages on mountaintops and in inaccessible places? On the edge of cliffs, where if you, I don't know if any of you are sleepwalkers, you don't want to sleepwalk here, okay? Cliffs where you can observe river passages, anybody coming upstream into the interior, you can observe these. And if you're up on the top of these cliffs, of course, it's a much more defensible position. Why do people build cities in such places? Lots of them. Lots of them. As I mentioned to you previously, rough Cilicia is absolutely unbelievable for the number of canyons, the depth of the canyons, and also the antiquities that can be found strewn throughout this region. This is a city called Karabojulu. You can see some of the sarcophagi. Actually, these are not sarcophagi. They're actually called commissorium tombs that are built into the bedrock. You can see one of the lids off on the left-hand side that is started to topple down. And then you can see further over onto the right-hand side, the canyon that falls off on the right-hand side. Why do people build cities in such dangerous locations, such strategic locations, such places that are difficult to access? Another question that we have to take into consideration. Then the other thing that puzzles me as I examine this region is we have many cliff face dwellings. Let me zoom in here a little bit. These are caves that were cut. Some of them were natural caves to begin with, but were enlarged during the Hellenistic period where people were living. The people who lived here would have rope ladders that they would extend down to the canyon floor and would be able to climb up into these dwellings. And then, of course, if unwanted intruders were to come, they would take the rope ladder course and pull it up so that people couldn't get to them. But again, it's a strange phenomenon. What do these people fear? Why are they building watchtowers? Why are they building cities, towns, and villages in such strategic, remote, isolated, and clifftop locations? More caves. Again, this is what is, to me, so fascinating about this region. It is scenic, it is beautiful, it is rough, it is rugged, and it's just loaded with interesting things like this. Dwellings. I'm actually looking, and when I took this shot, let me go back to that. I'm actually on one side of the canyon taking, you can see actually part of the stone off onto the upper right-hand corner, taking a shot to the other side of the canyon. And on both sides of the canyon, you see these dwellings. Just amazing. So let's see if we can answer that question about why people build watchtowers, cities in such locations. Why is it they build their dwellings in cliff faces? We actually have some literary sources that can help us out in that regard. So in the middle of the 2nd century BC, we have the writings of Strabo, Cicero, and Dio Cassius. And one of the things that they tell us about what was happening during this period of time is that there were pirates that had come to the coastal areas and had sacked the coastal cities. Not only would they rob the people in the coastal cities, but they would also take the residents of the coastal cities and sell them off on the Roman trade, on the Roman slave markets. I mentioned to you before, the Roman slave markets were massive. It was a source of huge and incredible income, especially for the pirates. And so what happened is, during the 2nd century, one of the phenomena, we don't have enough time to get into a lot of detail with this, but the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms declined in power during this period of time. And so they withdrew from this region of rough Cilicia. What that resulted in is anarchy, okay? Kind of like what is happening, if I can give you a parallel, kind of what's happening to defund the police, so to speak, okay? Anarchy takes place. You have thieves that emerge, and in particular, pirates. Piracy grew throughout this region, and it swept all across, not through Cilicia alone, but all across the southern Anatolia coastline. So into Pamphylia, into Lycia, into Caria, all of the major cities succumbed to the pirates and were either cooperating with the pirates, or many of the residents had retreated from the coastal cities up into the interior, the hinterland. Okay, it became such a problem that it affected the grain that was being shipped to Rome. Rome had anywhere between 800,000 and 1 million residents, and they needed food. Where did the grain come from? Much of that grain came from southern Anatolia. And the piracy became such a problem, okay, that the Romans tried to deal with it. They ended up sending 5 of their best generals. I've got them listed here, if you can see. Marcus Antonius, the elder Marcus Antonius. There's lots of Marcus Antoniuses. Then Sulla, Servilius Vatia, Mark Antony, and finally Pompey. In each instance, they came home to Rome, were given a triumph, a victory celebration, say, I did it, I cleaned up the piracy. That's Roman propaganda. All civilizations and all rulers have propaganda, okay? It's blowing out of proportion what really happened. I'll tell you what happened. The pirates retreated up into the mountainous area, into some of these regions that I'm describing for you, and it was impossible for the Romans to eradicate them from the mountains. So when the Roman troops moved on, the pirates came back down to the coastal cities and reoccupied them and resumed their piracy. And that's the reason why for over it's over more than 3 centuries, the piracy continued in spite of the fact that the Romans were sending these generals to try and clean it up. I've got a quotation here that I'll read from Appian, who describes the situation. He says they had fortifications, heights. He's talking about the pirates. They had fortifications, heights, deserted islands, and retreats everywhere. And they chose for their primary hangout the coast of Cilicia, where it was rough and harborless. He's talking about rough Cilicia. He's talking about precisely this area. This was the centerpiece of piracy. They chose for their primary hangout the coast of Cilicia, where it is rough and harborless and rose in high mountain peaks. And for this reason, they are all called by the common name Cilicians. In other words, if you refer to Cilicians, okay, that was roughly in the minds of Romans and anybody else that you had talked to, oh, they must be pirates. Anybody who came from Cilicia must be a pirate. Well, the fact of the matter is, not all the Cilicians were involved in piracy. Okay, many of the people who formerly resided in the coastal areas retreated up into the mountains. That's why they occupied these strategic locations, these clifftop locations. This is the reason why they built their dwellings into the cliff faces. This is one of the reasons why they built watchtowers, because if they could see pirates coming in to the interior, they would rally troops together and try and defend themselves. This is another feature that you commonly see. And again, one of the things that excites me about visiting Cilicia is that you commonly see reliefs such as you see here. And these are frequently cut into the cliff faces. It's a soldier. In his right hand, he's holding a spear. In his left hand, he's holding his sword, which is called the gladius. It's where we get the word gladiator, it comes from the sword. Others, cliff faces, you have to climb up to see some of these. Soldiers with a spear, with gladius. Some of these are tombs. Some of these are located near the cliff cut dwellings, okay? And basically what these reliefs are telling people who are entering in, who are venturing up the rivers, is that we are prepared to defend ourselves. Like I say, you see dozens of these all over rough Cilicia. And they're They're displayed in very conspicuous places, whereas if you are traveling from the coastal regions into the interior, you're going to see these. And basically, the residents are saying, we will fight. I mean, you've pushed us out of our coastal homes. We have come up into the hinterland here, and we're going to fight. And then the other thing that I enjoy seeing here are Roman roads and bridges. Now, the bridge that you see me walking on here is not ancient. It is what they call in Turkey a modern bridge. It is not what I'd call a particularly secure bridge, but it's also built on the piers of a Roman bridge that existed earlier. Elsewhere, you can see numerous Roman roads that still survive today. This is one of them. You can see Roman paved stones along the way. Frequently, you'll see milestones even, sometimes inscriptions. Sometimes you'll see little grottos for deities, local deities to be worshiped. So you may pour out a libation at the foot of one of these grottos, asking the god to protect you on your journey. You see that this particular road is en route to Dea Caesarea and to the interior. You also see many Roman bridges. This one's, I love this one because it's so well constructed. This is a bridge that's lasted for 2,200 years. Today, we have a hard time building a bridge that'll last 50 years. But Romans knew how to build bridges that lasted. And then aqueducts. Okay, once the Romans came in, and once we get into the Byzantine period, of course, these cities and towns needed water supplies. And so aqueducts were erected to bring water even across some of these ravines, some of these gorges, some of these canyons to the people. And so just a little bit of what you can see in rough Cilicia today. It's an exciting place to be. I mean, it's hard for me to communicate. I've said it already a dozen times, but this is what brings me back year after year. Just a couple of shots of pirate enclaves. This is at Antiochia ad Cregum, which was a known pirate location. It is on the coast. What the pirates would do is they would bring their ships inside of that hole there. This is a large opening. It's hard to get some perspective. Let me just zoom in a little bit, but they would bring their ships in through that entrance. And of course, your ships are hidden. And then they would climb up onto the heights up here and would be able to see ships that were coming from a distance. And if they would see ships that they could attack, they would climb down, get into their ships, and then do their piracy. But this is one of those locations that we know pirates were operating out of. And we have a lot of insight because of how they could hide their ships in some of these places and operate in a discreet manner. This is another, what is assumed to be a pirate hideout. This is also a cliff face location. Let me just mention that when the 5 Roman generals came and attacked the coastal cities, the pirate cities, the pirates, as I mentioned to you previously, retreated into the interior, okay, until the Roman troops moved on. The question, what happened then to the indigenous residents, the Cilician people who formerly occupied the coast, who had also retreated into the interior? What happened to them? Well, there's fighting that's going on, okay? And what happened is when the Roman troops forced the pirates out of the coastal areas, the pirates went into the interior, which then further displaced the indigenous residents, the original people who were residing in Cilicia, and they were forced to move further into the interior. And so that's part of the dynamic, the interplay of what's going on here. As the Romans are trying to clean up piracy and didn't do a very good job of it, okay? And then the pirates retreating from the Romans, but in the process also intruding into the interior with the native residents of Cilicia who have, you can imagine the trauma that they're going through. This took place all through the second century, especially the second half of the second century BC, all through the first century BC, all through the first century BC, or the first century AD. First century AD. In other words, the time when Paul was there. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians. I'd read that one passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talked about 14 years earlier, I had this apocalyptic experience entering up into the third heaven. The chapter before that, Paul again gives us a little information on some of his journeys, okay? And this is a long passage. I'm only quoting from 2 verses in this passage. Chapter 11, verses 26 and 27. And this is where Paul says, I've been on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers. Let me just pause there for a moment. The Greek word for robbers is the Greek word lestes. The word robber is equally applied to a pirate or a robber on land. Okay, it's the same word. It's just that they operate in different domains. So when Paul talks about dangers from rivers, I can show you many river crossings that Paul had to make. And those aren't easy. Okay, then dangers from robbers, he's talking about the pirates. He's talking about the pirates that have infiltrated into the interior. That was a constant danger, not only for the native Cilician residents, but for Paul himself. Dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, cold, and exposure. And I can just imagine Paul traveling through this region that I've shown you just a bit of. You know, he's not always going to find hospitality. So he's going to be in hunger and thirst, cold and exposure. He's going to be sleeping out under the elements. He's not always going to find food. But yet Paul realized that the gospel he carried was so important that he was willing to encounter those dangers in order to achieve his mission. Now let me just finish up. This is another Roman road. You can see me on it. And any of you that are interested, I've got a website that my Turkish friends actually set up for me. They kept pestering me for the last decade to set up a website so I can share pictures, some of my publications. I'm also downloading a lot of my lectures at Huntington University. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, there's lots of assorted materials there at my website. And if you're interested in pursuing some of that, take a peek at it. It's called ancientbiblicalworld.com. Yeah, I'll turn it over to you. And I know I've taken up a lot of time, but I don't know if do we have time for questions, answers?
Yes, absolutely. Well, hopefully, if you have time, I hope that listeners as well, but I certainly not in no hurry. I could listen to it all day long, nonstop. Keep talking.
Yeah,
well, there are some questions, but before I'll read to you some questions, and there are some of the particular and others of more general nature. I'm going to present to you as they were coming. Why do you think we have any kind of written legacy of Paul's mission into the region of rough Cilicia? Is it just because it didn't survive, or because he didn't write, as he did not feel that he was appointed to do the mission yet and it was his first trial? Or it's purely speculative, but just nevertheless curious.
I think if you study the Acts of the Apostles is in many ways misnamed. It's called the Acts of the Apostles, plural. But really, what Luke does is he depends upon his sources, okay? He doesn't have information about Thaddeus or Bartholomew. He doesn't have any information about where Thomas went. He doesn't have any information about where John went. We have some of that information from early church sources. He tells us very little about Peter. We know that Peter had a mission in Anatolia, and then he finally made his way to Rome, but first it was in Anatolia. We don't read about any of the apostles in depth. And the only person we have information in a little more substance is Paul, who wasn't really even originally one of the 12 apostles, okay? The thing is, Luke is a very accurate historian, okay? but he's heavily dependent upon sources and information that he receives. So we know, as scholars have studied the Acts of the Apostles, that he had a Jerusalem source, he had an Antiochian source. Early church tradition tells us that Luke traveled with Paul for not all of his journeys, but a portion of his journeys. And my suspicion is Luke just doesn't have good information about that particular time in Paul's life.
Mhm. Okay. So, questions. What is the other inscription next to menorah? It's about the synagogue that you have discovered.
Oh, I was worried that somebody's going to ask me that question because it will take me an hour to explain. Can I do it in 5 minutes?
Please do.
When I was invited to Vienna University, okay, and made my presentation, I thought it was a lulav. A lulav is another Jewish symbol, not as common, and that is in commemoration of Sukkot, an important Jewish holiday. There was a Jewish scholar from Hebrew University. They had invited Hebrew scholars, Jewish scholars, and synagogue scholars from New York City and Jerusalem and elsewhere in the world to discuss and debate. I'm trying to remember his name. I don't want to spend time. At any rate, he says, "Is that a lulav? I've never seen a lulav like that." And I says, "Yeah, I haven't either, but we've never seen a synagogue as early as this. And so it's difficult for us to determine how these early symbols evolved and everything of that sort." So after the conference was over and everything of that sort, I continued to scratch my head and do research on that symbol to find out what it is. Well, I know now what it is. There's no question about it. It is Zeus's thunderbolt. We can see, especially on coins, thunderbolts that look just like that. We can also see on some reliefs Zeus's thunderbolt like that. Now, the follow-up question, I know all of you are thinking to yourself, what on earth is a pagan symbol doing on a Jewish synagogue? Again, I'm trying to abbreviate this. I have found other lintels that have a menorah and the thunderbolt of Zeus on it. And what I have concluded is that these are communities that bonded together because of a common enemy, and that being the pirates. What they did is they laid aside their differences, they bonded together in fellowship. It's not to say that they always worship the same God, but they bonded together with one another because of the piracy that threatened them. Let me take you to a writing called the Letter of Aristeas. Letter of Aristeas was written during the intertestamental period, the Hellenistic period, the same period of time that we're talking about. And in the Letter of Aristeas, which was written by a Jew, it is stated that that we worship the same God as the God-fearers. The only difference is we have a different name for him. They call him Zeus, we call him Yahweh. What does that indicate? That indicates that there are some Jews who are open-minded enough to say, hey, these are people who are theists, who believe in the same God. It's just that we apply a different name. You're also familiar with the fact that Acts of the Apostles talks about a group of people called the God-fearers. God-fearers are people who are former pagans who have become monotheists. They no longer worship the polytheistic gods of the Greeks and the Romans. They believe in only one God. Okay? And for many of those people, the one God that they believe in is Zeus. There are more than 300 inscriptions that have been found that are attributed to Theos Houpsistos. It's Greek, translated simply means the highest God. And 1/3, approximately 1/3 of those 300 plus inscriptions refer to Zeus Hoopsistos, Zeus, the highest God. Okay, now scholars who have studied this, Stephen Mitchell in particular is one of them, claims that these are probably God-fearers. Okay, people who formerly worshipped polytheistic gods, who came to the conclusion that the Jews are right. There's only one God. And they referred to that one God as Zeus, who's the highest God in the Greek pantheon, whereas the Jews referred to that God as Yahweh. And I think this is what is reflected in the letter of Aristeas, is that there are some Jews who realized that these God-fearers, there's not much difference between these God-fearers and what we believe. Now, there's much more detail, to that. I actually have a lecture on that I presented to other groups. And what I think is important for this is that Paul realized that reconciliation is a part of our ministry. What does Paul say about reconciliation? God has reconciled himself to us, and it's our task to be reconciled to others. And I think what Paul saw during this earliest mission of his is that he saw a Jewish community, several Jewish communities, that were reconciling themselves to people who were different, Gentiles.
Mark, those people who lived in those townships and villages, were they convert Jews or were they ethnic Jews, so to say? Were they from among the God-fearers, or they were Hellenists who became, Jewish by faith, or were they replants for all sorts of reasons? Well, it's impossible.
Probably they were Jews, okay, but we also know there were God-fearers. The synagogue that I had mentioned, remember I had shared with you that there are 3 inscriptions that
Right.
Theodore had discovered? One of those inscriptions I've never found. And I'm pretty sure the reason I've never found it is because in recent years, they've built a road out to this site. And when they created the road, I think they put the road over that inscription, because Bent tells us where the inscription was. There's an ancient church there also, and the inscription was near the ancient church. And the current road that was built there in recent years goes right next to that church. So I suspect the reason I haven't found that inscription is it's under the road. But in that inscription, it mentions 2 people. It refers to the Sabbath keepers, okay? And it also refers to the Heriesis, and that is fellow worshipers who are part of that community. Now, who are the fellow worshipers? I think that's a reference to the God-fearers. And I think those 2 people, I wish I could even spend more time talking about the inscription, because the inscription talks about curses that were being slung within the community. I think the backstory here is that there were some people at Chatiorin who were cooperating with the pirates. As a consequence, curses were being slung against them. And this inscription rescinds those curses and basically says, it levies fines against anybody. It rescinds those curses and levies fines against anyone who wishes to render a curse from this point forward. And I think that is just a strong indication that this was a community that was reconciling itself to its neighbors who were not Jewish, neighbors who, in some instances, were pagans. In some instances, they were God-fearers.
Thank you. Can you tell us again, please, the name of the place where the oldest synagogue was found?
Chatiorin. It's spelt with a C, and then the C has a little tail under it, which in Turkey renders it with a CH sound, ch. And then it's AT, and then I with what looks to be, it's an I without the dot on top of it, okay, which you pronounce with the sound, okay? It's different than I, R-I. And then Orin, O with an umlaut, 2 dots over the top of it, looks like a German umlaut, and then E-N. So it's Cationen.
Mhm. Were there any excavations done in the synagogue that you have discovered since you have
Nothing.
discovered it?
Nothing. Since the article was published, I've actually had some emails from, actually they've all come from Jewish groups who have asked about doing an excavation, which I would like to see, but nobody has started anything up to this point. It's going to take some expertise. You have to assemble an archaeological team. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to be difficult because of the remote location. And then you also have to go through all the red tape of the Jewish or of the Turkish government to excavate such a site. Today, the Turkish government wants to have, for any new excavation, they want a Turkish archaeologist to be the head of the operation. That complicates things. You know, how many Jewish archaeologists are going to be interested in excavating a Jewish synagogue, especially in a remote location? Bottom line is no, nothing's going on right now. As far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any plans to excavate the synagogue, but it would be really helpful to do so.
Mhm. Another question is on the sources. Were the other apostles in Turkey besides Paul at the same time? Philip, for example, did they meet in Turkey?
It's hard to say if they met, but if you go to Hierapolis on the west coast of Turkey, which is very, well, it's also known as Pamukkale. It's a very popular site, especially for Turkish people. They go there for the hot baths and for the travertine formations. There's hot springs there, was thought to be therapeutic. But there they have a marturion for Philip and a church which the Italians have excavated, and they believe they found Philip's tomb there. So, I mean, yeah, there's, you know, the chance of Paul and Philip connecting there is quite possible. We don't have any specific information to tell us so. Likewise, we know that John, at some point, probably, you know, it may have been that John migrated to Ephesus after the destruction of Jerusalem. If that's the case, he wasn't there at the same time as Paul. But the bottom line is, again, we don't know when John made his way to Ephesus. It's possible he could have been there earlier. Peter, we know that, let me take that for it. I say we know. It's probable that Peter was in Anatolia. Did he cross paths with Paul? Hard to say. And then others. Problem is, we don't have a complete record of the travels of many of the apostles. I wish we had more information.
But again, a hypothesis made even if the Acts of the Apostle in their current form is more or less, if you look at it for what it is a Jewish affair, just at the point of changing into the Gentile, mainly represented by the God-fearers, it's not improbable with such an abundance of synagogue all over Anatolia that the other apostles traveled there as well, or their immediate students.
Oh, I agree. I think it's quite
safe to say.
Yeah. This area of Cilicia has a particular concentration of Jews, as I've mentioned to you, but synagogues can be found elsewhere. On the west coast, many synagogues. On the southern coast, not far from Antalya, there's evidence of a Jewish synagogue there as well. So yeah, The problem is it's hard to discover either inscriptions or relief menorahs or items of that sort. If you go to Cita, for instance, I was surprised. Cita is a coastal city that's actually a little bit east of Antalya, probably about 40 miles east of it. Cita was also a pirate enclave. It's mentioned in some of the ancient literature as being a place that was sacked by the pirates, and the pirates essentially were operating out of Cita. But in Cita, they have a museum there of artifacts that have been discovered and excavated at Cita. And on one of the walls, there is a menorah that's placed upside down. So we know that there must have been Jews in Cita as well.
Another question, did they paint the soldier statues? I assume the question is about reliefs, the carved reliefs in the mountains that you have showed us.
What's the question? Oh, I didn't get the question.
Did they paint actually?
Those
carvings?
It's hard to say. Many statues were painted. So it wouldn't surprise me if the relief cuts were also painted. I just can't confirm that for sure. The thing is, one of the things that baffles me is when you are making these reliefs, how are you doing that? I mean, they must have had ropes where they're hanging from ropes to make these reliefs. And the same thing with the caves. That's a dangerous job. You got to wonder how many people perished making their homes in the cliff faces and making some of these features that you see. No doubt many did. We have construction accidents that are, even in spite of OSHA, we've got OSHA who kind of tries to oversee construction to make sure that safety is good, but we still have accidents that take place, and no doubt that happened in the past.
Another question, what is the timeline when those townships have been developed? So naturally, from pirate enclaves, and when Paul have traveled there, those were perhaps of a smaller size towns. But naturally, when you showed us pictures of the bridges and the aqueducts and everything else, it calls for more sizable communities and large investment into upgrading the sites themselves.
That's a great question. Many of the cities were established originally during the Hellenistic period. We can date that because of what is called polygonal construction. That is the way that the dwellings were constructed during that period of time. And polygonal construction generally represents the Hellenistic period. But we also have ashlar construction. That's a later period of time. Ashlar construction began chiefly during the Roman period. And then when we have churches that can be discovered in these locations, we know that they were also occupied during the Byzantine period. So we've got several periods. Each of these towns were not, occupied for like 100 years and then they disappeared. Okay, most of those that I have examined were founded during the Hellenistic period, continued to be occupied during the Roman period. When we talk about the Roman period, we're talking about the 1st century AD, at the time of Christ, the time of Paul. And then the presence of Byzantine churches indicates that they were occupied through the Byzantine period, that is following Constantine, and then generally where they were abandoned probably during the early Islamic period. Most of them were. As you know, the Muslims during the 7th, 8th century began to invade what is today Turkey, conquered Turkey. Many of the Christians fled from Turkey. Some were killed, some were forced to embrace Islam. And so a lot of these cities that I'm talking about in particular were abandoned in the late Byzantine period. And then there's other cities that there's no evidence of an origin during the Hellenistic period. Many of these other cities were first established during the Roman period. Most of them, though, if we're generalizing here, most of them were first established during the Hellenistic period and continued to be occupied for several hundred years after that.
Another question came, anything inside the oldest synagogue that would further indicate its use?
The synagogue is, if I recall, something along the line of maybe 14 feet by 14 feet. So it's not huge, probably indicating a small Jewish community with God-fearers. On the inside of the lintel that you see, inside lintel, there's another menorah that's etched. I didn't show you a picture of that. On the far side wall, there's a niche about, what can I say, this big, okay, which I think probably contain Torah scrolls. Generally speaking, a synagogue will have what's called an ark. An ark would be a wooden box in which the Torah scrolls, that is the sacred scriptures of the Jews, would be kept. And that is always pointing towards Jerusalem. That niche is in the direction of Jerusalem. So again, I can't say for sure, but it's the only niche that we have in the entire synagogue. And it's pointing towards Jerusalem. I think that's what I believe would be an ark. And then two interesting features that are actually on the outside of the, I'm going to try and see if I can find some photos that I can give you. There is a mikvah. A mikvah is a Jewish ritual bath. And any Jew that would enter into either the temple in Jerusalem or a synagogue would have to first immerse themselves in a mikvah. And then another feature is there's a rock-cut staircase leading up to a second floor. So we know that this synagogue had a loft, perhaps a balcony. And I suggest that that was for God-fearers and perhaps also for women. Women were not permitted to reside in the same place as the men. Here, let me share this screen with you folks. Okay, you can see that? That's the photograph that I showed you earlier. There we go. And this is the menorah. You can see right here, the menorah that's on the inside of the lintel. This is the inside of the lintel that you saw in the previous picture. Here is that niche in the wall, okay, that I think was where an ark and the Torah scrolls might have been stored. And this is in the direction of Jerusalem. This is how you have to climb up. It's not an easy ascent. This is the central ridge. And then here you can see off onto the right-hand side, this is a water basin, which is a mikvah. Now, it's not your typical mikvah. A typical mikvah, you have to descend steps and you immerse yourself full body. This is an early mikvah, which is a foot bath. Actually, it's very similar to this. Herschel Shanks from the Biblical Archaeology Society said a similar one of these can be found at near the Dead Sea in Israel. And then you can see over here rock-cut steps that lead up to a second floor. Here's another picture of that basin, water basin. Over here, okay, there is a water inlet. There was a pipe there and a water channel that was cut. If you go higher up onto the ridge, there is a cistern that collects water, and that cistern then leads down into this water basin. Now, for a mikvah, you have to have what is called living water. Jesus talked about living water, as a matter of fact, when talking with the Samaritan woman. And that is water has to flow into the mikvah and also out of the mikvah. And so down here where I'm pointing, you can see that? Okay, that is a water outlet, okay, so that you have flowing water. A mikvah is for ritual purification. Okay, so a Jew, before entering into the synagogue would have to step into the mikvah, clean himself. And then you have actually, you can see over here, 2 footpads also, where people could slip off their sandal, wash their feet before going into the synagogue. I thought I had more pictures of the synagogue, but that's it. So yeah, there's other features that confirm that that structure is a synagogue. Yeah, it's, yeah, I just didn't include all those shots.
It's very, very fascinating. It's too bad that there was no any kind of research done, you know, to see what they could find there.
I think it is a project that is worthy, but it'll be tough for the reasons that I've already mentioned.
How far it is from Tarsus? Like 50 miles, less?
I'd say 45, maybe 50 at max. But the problem is you also have to go into the interior. It's not a coastal city. Fortunately, in recent years, they've built a road out there. So it's easier to get out there now.
So it's considered to be like an archaeological park or just wilderness?
No, it's out in the brush. I mean, it's all covered with dense brush. So it's not easy to get around there. I found a Roman road. There's a Roman road that goes through the city, leads north to Izmireli Oranieri. So you can actually walk a part of that road that leads into the city that connects the two towns. It was a fortress also. It was a fortified city. So you know that whoever built that built it to protect themselves. But it's also closer than some of the cities and the towns that are further into the interior. This is closer to the coast than some of those. And I think it was eventually overrun by the pirates. So I don't think they were able to successfully ward off the pirates. I think and that's the inscription that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Pirates finally made their way into this city. They were able to infiltrate the city. Some of the people at Châteauroun cooperated with them. And that's the reason why some of these curses were issued is you know, there are residents of the city who didn't like the people of Châteauroun that cooperated with the pirates.
Mark, some time ago, already maybe a year or if not more, you sent me pictures of some Byzantine frescoes from some cave.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, it was in Western Anatolia, or it was still in Cilicia.
It's in Isauria. Okay, Isauria is deeper into the mountains.
So, but it's basically in this general region.
It's this general region, correct? Yes. Deeper into the mountains.
Deeper into the mountains. Interesting, very fascinating.
Yeah, I'd like to. That's a tough location to get to. I mean, Ilya, I'd like to take you with me, but I'm telling you what. When I was there, the person who showed, I had never gone there on my own. Okay, but I had a Turkish friend who showed me the place, and you have to climb to get to it. And then once you climb to it, you have to come across a cliff face. And whoever occupied that had footholds that are about this wide and hand grips that you have to hold. And you have to go across maybe 50, maybe that's too far, maybe about 40 yards on these handholds in these little foot ledge. Like I say, it's a ledge that's only about this wide or so. And then you finally get to the cave and you're able to climb into the cave. But I wouldn't recommend most people going there because whenever I take a group, especially if it's a student group, okay, students think they'll live forever. They think they are immune to and students take chances. And I wouldn't take a student group there simply because if one kid does something stupid, I'll regret that for the rest of my life. And then, of course, that location also is not good for a church group. Lots of times I take a church group over to Turkey, and with a church group, you're going to get people who are not in shape and just aren't suited for that kind of stuff. The thing is, when I took those photos also, I didn't have my flash attachment. the photos that I sent you were my friend using a flashlight. And you can see that they're not as good as they should be. So I'd like to go there again and get some good pictures of
those are amazing. I should have probably asked your permission, but I didn't acknowledge your name, and I did not disclose the location. I said these are the frescoes, and people were those who are experts in Byzantine art were arguing where those pictures may have been taken from, because nobody saw them before, quite naturally. So it created quite a rage.
You know, it would be fun to have your Byzantine experts, you know, the friends, you've got a community that I don't typically connect with, because my community is more New Testament period, or even the early Roman imperial period, you know, even beyond, you know, getting into the 2nd century. But your area of expertise is more Byzantine, and I, quite honestly, that I'm weak in that area. But it would be fun to get a group together with you and some of your colleagues and go to some of these places.
Have it like a joint venture. Well, we need to work on it. And the time past COVID.
Really, and get Todd in this too. Todd has, Todd's a friend of mine that I connected. Todd, I don't even remember how it is that we connected, but we've been Facebook friends for a long time. And you've always had a, you know, deep and abiding interest in Turkey. Todd, do you want to unmute and jump in?
Yes, very, very true. Very true. And it can't seem to shake it.
Todd, you can turn the camera on.
Okay, let me try.
We could see you. I think we just became friends on Facebook earlier.
Video mute. Maybe that'll do it. There we go.
Okay, there he is. Good to see you, Todd.
See you both.
I'm glad you were able to join us.
Excellent. I'm just blown away. Excellent presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, I think you and I have talked about traveling together at times also, but for one reason or another, we were never able to hook up. You've been in Turkey how many times overall?
Just 3.
Just 3?
Yeah, just 3 times.
I would have guessed more than that.
But I study it quite extensively. That's pretty much my my heart is studying, you know, Pauline studies, and lately I've been on the Temple Mount, so it keeps, you know, urging me to go back. So when COVID lifts, I'm think I'm going to be ready to go.
Okay. What do you do normally? Are you a pastor, Todd?
I'm a contractor. No, I have a theology degree, but I'm actually a contractor in Washington, D.C.
What kind of construction do you do?
Work on like remodeling, a lot of like in Calorama and DuPont Circle, the more prestigious areas of DC.
You know, Todd, I ought to haul you out here to Indiana, because my wife and I are going to do a backyard patio with.
Mark, I did want to ask another question, if I might, because there's the because of what is happening at the Temple Mount right now, and the current discouragement of uncovering more evidence as far as Jewish periods of occupation, wouldn't that also kind of play as a negative for doing an excavation in Turkey?
I think that may be part of the issue, because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, any new excavation in Turkey, Turkish authorities want to have a Turkish archaeologist being the head of the chief director in charge of matters. And I understand that, because Turkey has been ripped off of some of their antiquities in the past, and they want to keep everything in-house. And even more recently, you're familiar with what happened at the Boston Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Getty Museum. Turkey is sued to get a lot of these artifacts back, and have been successful in getting many of them, but they haven't been so successful with the Germans and for many other artifacts. So I understand where the Turks are coming from, but the point that you raise, I think is true. I hate to acknowledge it, but there's an anti-Jewish bias among the, in particular, the AKP, the current administration in Turkey. And I had a Turkish friend who was doing a film project with me, and we met with the Minister of Culture and Tourism. Okay, we actually met with a couple of people. Number one, we talked to the person who's in charge of film, who's part of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And he loved our project. We've already done some filming for it, okay? He loved our project and really wanted to go forward with it. So we then went to the minister, the head honcho for tourism and ministry. And he's one of these old AK party individuals who's got a chip on his shoulder, who's got this religious agenda. And he makes this statement about how the best archaeologists in the world are Turkish. So why do we want some American coming over here and telling us about our heritage? And why do we want, to promote Jewish antiquities in our country? And it was pretty clear at that point to, my friend's name was Tolga. Pretty clear to Tolga, and Tolga's a great guy. I'd love to introduce you to him. Pretty clear to Tolga and I that through this guy, we're getting nowhere. The individual below him, who's in charge of film productions and stuff for the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, he loved it. If it was his decision, of course, we'd have progressed with the whole project, but well, it stopped right there.
Yeah.
Well, in general, of course, you know how much you know about it or not. In recent years and in recent months, there was a tremendous anti-cultural reverse, in particular with turning Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, which is an incredibly big deal, objectively speaking, historically and cultural and such. Then Hora Church in Istanbul and Constantinople. Prior to that, there was Church of Our Lady of Pamakaristos that was beautifully restored and was open only for 3 or 4 years, but then it closed again for restoration. In time, it was just open from restoration. And there are a number of Byzantine monuments that are absolutely glorious and splendid, but stayed neglected, and no research was really ever done on them. But in recent years, there was quite a bit of money poured in to revamp them and restores them as the mosques, even though already functioning as the mosque. But there are so many mosques there are simply not enough people to fill all of those mosques. So to have them as cultural monuments and tourist attractions would have generated much more revenue, but it's just simply not done. It's just simply not done, unfortunately. And of course, for the Eastern Christian Byzantine period of history, there is so much that originated in Anatolia. It's not only the place of mission of Apostle Paul, but most of the church councils, writings of early church fathers that are fundamental to the Eastern Christian theological thought, various monasteries, various form of asceticism. If you look at the calendar of the saints of the Byzantine church, like 3/4 of them are in Anatolia, actually. People thinking of the Holy Land as Israel, Jordan, maybe parts of Syria, but in fact, there is much more ties to Anatolia. I mean, naturally, because of the imperial presence, imperial endowments and such, and largely it's go undetected. And if anything is presented, even like in Pamukkale, where I'm sure you've been, in Hierapolis, people who coming through Tavertines, they may see a little bit of ancient ruins, but it goes back to Hellenistic Roman period. Nobody talks about the Byzantine period, and it's one of the most important pilgrim sites, if to think about it. Among my own people who have traveled with me, there is this quiet fear of Turkey. First of all, there's very little knowledge. Second, the tragedy of the 20th century and purging of the Assyrians and Armenians and Greek population exchange, and what's happening now completely overshadows the importance of the vast historical material terrain and holy sites and important historical sites, if you wish, to the Eastern Christians that are still in Turkey. And there are some absolutely amazing people who are working on discovery of those sites, but overall, I'm not sure where the formal government policy is in relation to all of that and how well it is promoted and such. They did quite amazing work in Laodicea. There were holy scriptures, as we know, that have been assembled and such, and restoring the church there. But it's one of the more positive examples. As far as everything else, it's tends to be quite a bit neglected or dwells in the realm of fairy tales instead of true history and research. Like most of the Turkish guides, at best, they could say a couple of words about biblical period that is still foreign to them, but even if you're traveling to Cappadocia, most could not make a coherent presentation about what they see there. One times it's pretty much clear and mainstream if people have any knowledge of the Eastern Church.
I have conducted seminars for Turkish tour guides. One of them was more than 80 Turkish tour guides from all over Turkey that had come. And their knowledge of Christianity is just paper thin. They really enjoyed it because their school system doesn't talk about their Christian heritage. They completely ignore it. And as Ilya, as you had mentioned, you know, the posture that they take towards the Armenians, okay, denying what everybody else calls genocide, the posture that they take towards the Greek Orthodox Church, even though the Greek Orthodox Church is still centered in Istanbul. What Erdogan wants to do is to give the impression that there are civil rights and religious rights. And he's done a somewhat adequate job of giving that impression. But the reality of the matter is he's trying to put down Christianity, Judaism, and making it difficult for churches to survive, new churches to be established. The Christian community, if you talk to the Christians in the country, they can tell you much better than I do some of the difficulties that they're facing. Even talking about, you know, we talk about the closing of the Hagia Sophia and the Cora churches. You can go back to Trabzon, the Hagia Sophia at Trabzon, converted into a mosque. If you look at Nicaea, the Hagia Sophia at Nicaea used to be a church, and now it has been converted into a mosque. This is a systematic program that they're going through. I have tried for the most important Byzantine monastery in Istanbul is the Studion of St. John.
Which I've tried for years and years.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to get into that. It's been long ago. It was converted into a mosque, and I've tried to get into that mosque. It's not an active mosque, anyways. But I've tried to get in there. I tried to get governmental position to get permission to get into the Studion, and they won't allow it. They say it's under construction. Well, I'll tell you what, it's been under construction for 15 years, and they're not doing anything. And yet they won't let somebody come in just to photograph and to view and to observe. You have to look through. There's a big fence out and around it. And so there's a few gaps where you can take a peek at the outside, maybe a little bit, but it's nonsense. I mean, you're not doing anything at the site, and yet you keep telling us it's under construction.
And curiously enough, there is a guard with the dog there, so you could not just climb in and explore the site. No.
Yes, you're right. And I would climb in if permissible. Ilya, you've been there then. You've tried to get in?
We tried to get into Studion, and curiously enough, also was a name Tolga. I wonder if it's the same person or not.
No, because the Tolga I know is from Ankara.
So we tried to talk to the guard and got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And in fact, there is no construction that is going on, and there is very fascinating early Byzantine Basilica. And it's in a rather poor state of preservation, but you still can see floor mosaic, and you can see altar apse with the presbyterian, with the amphitheater seats going up like in many other Byzantine churches over the time and everything. It's incredibly fascinating, and you justly noted very important site, but we simply do not have any way to access it. And it would have been an amazing tourist site, amazing religious site. Studion played an incredibly important role in theological debates early on in the Byzantine Empire, besides the program of the services that was celebrated throughout the empire in the early centuries, did come from Studian. George says, you can bribe Turk and he will let you in. They like bakshish. Yes, George, we tried. In fact, I didn't want to say it on the record. I said, name the figure. That's exactly what I said. Name the figure. And you know, the guy who liked bakshish said, he said, why my predecessors change so often, you think?
Because is he saying that others have bribed their way in?
Well, his predecessors, meaning the other guards who were there before, he didn't want to lose his job, so he refused, he declined.
Mm-hmm.
So we did try. So it's very sad, but it's certainly part of the reality, and it's lamentable, but I still believe that while it's still accessible in some form or shape, it needs to be seen, it needs to be visited, and I do believe in the living stones, so to say. I don't want to descend into the level of idol worshippers, but I believe that it's an important part of the legacy that by visiting it, we're making, alive, truly.
Yeah.
Well, dear friends, if you have any questions for Mark, anybody? No? All right. Well, Mark,
Well,
thank you
I've
so
got to
much.
say, it's been a pleasure sharing with you folks.
Thank
I've
you.
enjoyed the questions. It's good to be able to connect with you, Ilya, and Todd also.
Thank you.
It's been fun. I enjoy sharing. I mean, this is something that I'm passionate about. It's one of the reasons why every year I'm in Turkey. Many times I'm in Turkey 2, maybe even 3 times a year, because I think it's important. I think it's something that is not well promoted. I think a lot of people don't understand Turkey, and even modern developments of what's going on politically and culturally in Turkey. I think a lot of people don't understand, and I think it's good for us to get into the country and to be able to relate to these people. Many times that I'm traveling in central Turkey and Eastern Turkey in particular, I'm the only American these people have ever seen. Now in Western Turkey, that's not the case, but in Central and Eastern Turkey, in many instances, I'm the only American they've seen. And I think it's good to spread goodwill and to connect with these people and to establish some friendships. And, that's a small part of ministry that we can do even today.
Yeah. Mark, being an American for almost quarter of a century, let me ask you a very American question. How safe is it?
I can honestly tell you, I have never felt endangered in Turkey. Many times when I discover things, often what I'll do is I'll go to a remote village and there will be a cafe. An elderly gentleman will be sitting around the cafe. And I drive up and immediately all the heads turn to me because I'm, somebody that they don't typically see. And immediately the questions, what is your name? And they often ask, what are you doing here? Nobody comes here. And I let them know, I don't know a whole lot of Turkish, but I can make small conversation and let them know what I'm interested in. I'll sit down, I'll drink a cup of chai. I don't like chai, but I'm making a connection with them. I just befriend them. And many times, people that I've never met before in my life will jump in my rental car with me and will take me to some of these sites. People will take me home, have fed me. I've had instances where complete strangers that I met just that day insisted that I cancel my hotel reservation and stay with them. Some of the most hospitable, kind people that I think I've ever met, even in America. I think sometimes Americans can be very cold, especially to strangers and outsiders. I've not experienced that in Turkey. I need to be, I think like anybody, whether it's in America or in a foreign country, you need to have your head screwed on. You need to be cautious. But as I mentioned, I don't there's never been a time when I felt endangered in Turkey. That, hey, I need to withdraw from this and to get out of this situation. I'm not treated disrespectfully ever in Turkey. And when I first came to Turkey, I thought with America's bad reputation that if people discovered that I'm an American, there's going to be some pushback and some negative reaction, and I've not found that.
I concur. I have had some amazing experiences, not only in Turkey, but in Jordan, for instance, where people unexpected would welcome half of the tourist bus to their house and offer whatever they have, and people live in abject poverty. We had a biblical once experience where a man wanted to slaughter a sheep for us, a lamb. And we declined because we had to stay there for 5 or 6 hours, and he said, "You're bringing me shame. What did they do wrong that you decline my hospitality?" You know, it's like a whole Abrahamic experience.
Yeah,
it's just quite amazing. The world is phenomenal.
I think I don't know what has happened, but in America and in Europe, we have really lost a sense of hospitality. We just have a strong distrust of strangers. And I think that distrust translates into just not being friendly, not wanting to make a connection, not really helping people who come to our country, whether it's for touristic reasons or even like students. At Huntington, we have many international students. And I think what I try to do is go the extra mile to welcome them. We had actually a Turkish student a few years ago that came and matriculated. He spent 5 years with us. He got 2 degrees. I had him over at our house many times. We have a fellowship that's called Friday at Fairchild, where we have students come over, and he came over frequently, and I still connect with him. He's one of my Facebook friends as well. But I think in America, we need to do a much better job of reaching out to people who, like me, in one sense, you can say I'm in Turkey, I'm vulnerable, even though I don't feel vulnerable. But it's the same kind of situation when we have international students or visitors or tourists that come to America, even people who come for business purposes.
Even as we were talking, a question came. If you allow me a question, can you give me a definition on Zeus, Ipsistos? You mentioned that the Greeks learned from the Jews the existence of one God. Alexander the Great mentions him as well.
The Greek word houpsistos means highest. And so I mentioned earlier, more than 300 inscriptions that have been found throughout the Mediterranean. Most of those inscriptions are found in Anatolia, and they refer to Theos, that's the word for God, houpsistos, the highest God, okay? And then about a third of them refer to Zeus, houpsistos. And these are people who it is believed, okay, were formerly pagans or Gentile people who came to the conclusion that there is only one God. Aphrodite, Artemis, Apollo, and the whole gang, they don't exist. There's only one God. And many of those people were listening to what the Jews were saying. Some of those people would go to the synagogues and would listen to the message. Since they were Gentiles, they were not permitted inside of the synagogue. And that's one of the reasons why some of the synagogues provided a separate room for these God-fearers so they could hear the Torah being read and could hear the message that was being proclaimed. And so many of these people came to believe, these were people who formerly were pagans, who came to believe that there's only one God. And some of those people believed that that one God was the Jewish God, the God that the Jews were talking about. And what is also interesting is when Paul went around the Mediterranean world, most of his converts came from the God-fearers, these people who were devotees, worshipers of the highest God, or even Zeus, highest God. Did that answer the question sufficiently?
Maria, if you'd like to turn your microphone on and elaborate on your question, you're most welcome to do so. Hello, Maria, can you hear us? Yep.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, hello. Well, yes, thank you for spending time to give an answer to my question. I just wanted a definition because, well, by the time of Alexander the Great, we know that he gave an oath to the people, starting by the phrase, according to Plutarch, that God is one, and we are all his children. And as we have a common father, it means that we are all his children. So this is how we should treat ourselves, like brothers and sisters do in a family. So the question is, if the Zeus Ipsistos from the time of Alexander the Great was actually an invention, or a communication with the Jews, and made Alexander change within the 3-4 years from the time that he met them to the time that he gave the oath. Because also in Greece, we have found many inscriptions referring to Zeus Ipsistos, but mainly from sanctuaries that date in the Roman times. This is what has been found in Greece and in Macedonia mainly. Or the earliest, as far as I know, is outside of Edessa in Logos site, which is the 2nd BC.
Yes, as a matter of fact, if you go to the museum at Thessaloniki, okay?
Yeah. This is where I am from. Yeah.
You're from Thessaloniki?
Yes.
Oh, well, wonderful place to be. But you see inside of the museum, they have a column there.
Mark, forgive me, sales pitch. Maria is a travel agent from Thessaloniki. You need to connect if you'd like to get the group there. You won't find a better host. You won't find a better biblical host. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Father Ilya. And I'm also a guide. So, okay, a licensed guide in Greece.
Oh, so you're familiar with that inscription inside
Yes.
of the, that refers to Theos Hupsistos. These inscriptions that I've mentioned are more than 100 years after Alexander the Great. As you mentioned, you know, the one that you're familiar with, 2nd century BC, and they continue in centuries after that. And quite honestly, I can't tell you, are these kind of a reflection or an outgrowth of Alexander and his thoughts? I quite honestly can't answer that question, but perhaps.
Yes, I can see it was a controversy that I had with a friend of mine and historian. Actually, she also studied in the University of Jerusalem. And she told me, Maria, you know, the point that you tell about Ipsistos is from the time that the Greeks came in contact with the Jews. And I tell her, okay, I know that there were Greek-speaking Jews that came to Greece from the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of the Solomon Temple, but we have reference to that from a time much earlier than Apostle Paul. And there has been also a very big question mark how much polytheistic or monotheistic the ancient Greek religion was. But most probably this is not our subject today. But since you mentioned about Ipsistos, I'd like to have your opinion, you know, on this. This is it.
During the Hellenistic period, I think there are a lot of dynamics that were taking place. Many of the Greeks, and I'm talking broadly, not necessarily in Greece itself or Macedonia, but a lot of the people who formerly had believed in the traditional Greek gods didn't believe it. And so as a consequence, some of those people were attracted to Greco-Roman philosophy. And course, you're familiar with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and just the proliferation of philosophies that just exploded during that period of time. And that is a consequence of people no longer believing in the traditional Greek gods. They were opting for something different. And then for others, many of them became monotheists. They didn't follow after or pander Greco-Roman philosophy. They no longer believed in the traditional Greek gods, but for whatever reasons, maybe it was because they were listening to Jews, maybe there were other factors that entered into it, but some of those people became monotheists. Now, that was not a big, broad, sweeping phenomenon. We're still probably talking about a significant minority of the population, but that was another expression of people who were saying, hey, I just don't believe it anymore. Because you read some of those, we get into a period with the Greek philosophies, we're getting into a period of reason, okay? And you yourself will acknowledge that, a lot of the stories, the myths that have been associated with the Greek gods just aren't believable. And so you had a falling out during that period of time, and the falling out resulted in philosophies being developed and many people falling after the philosophies. But I think a further outgrowth would be the people who are monotheists. And where did that come from? For some of them, they were listening to the Jews who lived in their own communities.
Yes, for sure. Yes, I know that, because many of the Greek philosophers had already traveled to that eastern part. So they surely came in contact with people that were monotheists.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Ilya, this has been wonderful. We're approaching 3:30 over here. I think I need to split.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your time, and if we ever be able to recruit you again for another presentation on Pergamon, for instance, or something, and Seat of Satan.
Okay.
I remember your explanation. You gave on the boat. Now, every time I possibly could use it, I pass for a smart guy. So I hope you don't mind. There is no copyright on that. Well, anyway, thank you so much. I thank you all, dear guests, for coming. We continue with our presentations on Saturdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on a variety of different subjects. And if you'd like to join us, please do so. Announcements are on our Facebook page. So those with whom we're not friends, you're most welcome to befriend me, and that way we'll stay in touch. And Mark, thank you most profoundly. God bless you and your family, and please stay healthy and well. And hope to see you before too long in person and break some bread with you.
God bless you all.
God bless. Thank you.